As part of his Northeast Asia trip, Joseph Dunford, the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, is paying a visit to China as the first visit of a top U.S. military officer to the region since President Donald Trump took office. What could General Dunford's trip achieve at this delicate time for geopolitics? Can the visit help shore up military ties between China and the U.S., as well as the stability of the region and the rest of the world? To discuss the many issues related to this trip, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Senior Colonel Zhou Bo from China's Ministry of National Defense, and Dr. Clifford Kirchhoff, who's a former senior professional staff member at the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Pandong. Before we get started, let's take a look at this.
High-level exchanges between the world's two top militaries. The head of China's Central Military Commission, Xi Jinping, has met with the visiting U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff General Joseph Dunford in Beijing. General Dunford also met with other senior Chinese military and diplomatic officials on Thursday. In talks with the vice chairman of China's Central Military Commission, Fan Changlong, Dunford expressed America's willingness to promote practical cooperation with China. Fan hailed the increased military communication between the two countries while reiterating that dialogue is the only and effective way to solve the issue. He added that military action should not be one of the choices.
From the moment that my delegation and I arrived in Beijing, we've been treated with great hospitality and respect. I think we've already made some progress by agreeing on a joint staff dialogue mechanism that will allow us to address these issues.
Dunford's trip comes 1 week after U.S. President Donald Trump and the DPRK exchanged heated rhetoric amid rising tensions. The DPRK said it would develop a plan to launch missiles over Japan and the U.S. territory of Guam in the Pacific Ocean. And following his much criticized fire and fury remarks, President Trump still hasn't eased up.
And if anything happens to Guam, there's going to be big trouble in North Korea.
Many in the international community are calling for calm, including South Korean President Moon Jae-in.
There must be no war on the peninsula. Whatever ups and downs we face, the North Korean nuclear situation must be resolved peacefully.
And both Russia and Germany have also stressed that military action is unacceptable. As tensions escalate on the peninsula, it seems everyone is keen to get all the parties concerned around the dialogue table.
So, gentlemen, I'd like to start with General Dunford's schedule on Thursday, August 17th. Chinese President Xi Jinping, who's also the chairman of China's Central Military Commission, have met General Dunford in Beijing. And President Xi said, I'm quoting, the visit is comprehensive, indicating military-to-military relations between China and the U.S. have made a substantial step forward. We know that military-to-military relationship is a constant theme in Sino-U.S. relations. So, timing is of great significance here. What's your take on this, Senior Colonel?
Well, since General Dunford is the highest ranking military officer of the United States in uniform, therefore his visit to China is extremely important for us. This is demonstrated in that our president actually met with him. So in terms of timing, I would say that this is not particularly important in that we would normally welcome people of such great importance to come to visit China anyway, and likewise for Chinese senior officers to visit the United States. But the fact is, as you have correctly pointed out, this relationship between China and the U.S. military is extremely important. Therefore, we definitely would most welcome his visit to China.
Well, what's your take on this, Doctor?
Well, the mil-mil is fundamental to the overall relationship, and the stabilization and development of relations with China really rests in particular on stabilizing and improving mil-mil relations. So when I saw on the television today the President Xi personally receiving General Dunford, this is a very good symbol of and a very important step to symbolize the interest of both sides in developing the mil-mil relations, stabilizing them, and moving forward.
And Senior Colonel, this visit coincides with the ever-worsening tensions on the Korean Peninsula. So regarding all the comments and reports from on General Dunford's visit, how do you think the major countries, major parties related in this crisis will deal with the tensions in the near future?
Well, that's a very grand topic because we are fully aware that he actually paid a visit to ROK before his visit to China. And I know actually DPRK issue, the nuclear issue and the missile issue, is one of the focus of his visit. Both sides talked for quite some time on these topics between him and his counterpart, General Fan Fenghui, and between him and General Fan Zhanglu. And I'm sure probably my president have also mentioned to a certain extent. This is a grand issue. The only question is how to resolve this. But the fact that he's in China and he's focused on this topic to demonstrate how such major powers like China and the U.S. should join hand in resolving this issue. But of course, we have fundamental differences as to how we shall have this issue resolved or how it could possibly resolved. This is not easy. It's easier said than to be done.
Right, so it's a grand topic, as you just mentioned, but let's get back to the specifics of General Dunford's visit. He visited Northern Theater Command in China.
Yes.
Is this somehow related to the DPRK tensions?
Well, it's understandable for people to think like that because of the geographical proximity between the area and the DPRK. But I would argue in a different way in that this is a great courtesy extended to General Dunford in that we actually had demonstrated exercise exclusively for him. This is somewhat unusual because if you normally won't just organize a drill for the visitor. China and the U.S. have a lot of joint exercises, be it in the Gulf of Aden in terms of counter-piracy or like a humanitarian disaster relief between China and U.S. And the United States was actually kind enough to invite China to participate in some of the U.S.-led exercises such as RIMPAC, which was held biannually, and Copper Gold in Thailand, in which the Chinese military have all attended.
So, Dr. Kirk, back to the DPRK issue, and in our earlier report we mentioned this Guam drama. So how did this issue turning from a game theory into a game of chicken?
Well, let me state straight out that the Trump administration from its inception in January began a policy review on North Korea as a high priority or the highest priority policy review to do quickly. And in February, the President Trump authorized a secret special envoy to go to DPRK. So we have established that channel and some other channels to talk with the DPRK.
Do you think the talk
behind the scenes?
The talks are actually working?
Well, there's the fact that DPRK received our special envoy and there's back and forth is very positive.
But then we see these ever-worsening tensions and war of words.
We both know, we all know, that the leader of North Korea is fairly flamboyant, and we know that the leader of the United States
but what's wrong
is fairly
on the US
flamboyant.
policy regarding the DPRK, Colonel?
Well, I think China's policy and American policy toward DPRK is actually the two sides of the same coin, because China would stress more on stability. That is, no war should occur at all on the Korean Peninsula, while the U.S. would stress on denuclearization. China, of course, would also ask for denuclearization, but the precondition is no war will ever occur on the Korean Peninsula. So we are actually having the same objective, but the approach is somewhat different. So this is why China asked for peaceful talks rather than any military attacks on DPRK for a possible solution.
What do you make of China's double suspension proposal on de-escalating tensions on the Korean Peninsula? Do you think the United States is willing to accept this proposal?
Well, it's a constructive proposal, but I myself...
But we still haven't heard clear acceptance from U.S. authorities so far.
It's a constructive proposal, but I think we need to think in bigger terms toward a comprehensive settlement of the entire problem, which would involve the neutralization of the Korean Peninsula, 2 states, 1 peninsula, and no nukes in the north, no nukes in the south, no THAAD in the south, no U.S. troops in the south, and a peace treaty between North Korea and the United States. So I think the overall issue, we have to have a more comprehensive package. Certainly those 2 points that you mentioned are good for confidence building, but I think we need to have a bigger vision and a more comprehensive diplomatic settlement of the overall problem.
So, Senior Colonel, do you think the United States and the DPRK is willing to talk at this particular moment?
No, I don't think so. I think they have some secret channels talking to each other anyway. These talks must be going on. When you talk about the suspension for suspension, let me add something. I do believe this is the only viable solution, which actually has taken account the elements from both DPRK and the United States. Actually, DPRK's ambassador to India said about a month and a half ago that something exactly like that. The fact is, the United States is the strongest military power in the world. So if it's a question of chicken and egg, what's the harm if the United States makes some concession just by suspending the exercise? If it doesn't work, you can resume. But give peace a chance. Give the suffocating space something to breathe, right? So then the other side probably might reciprocate. Yes, I know what the U.S. have been saying, because they believe it doesn't work, because they practiced that, tried that in the past, and they were cheated by DPRK. But from DPRK's point of view, they were also cheated by the United States. For example, in 1994, the United States promised to provide a light water reactor to exchange for DPRK's nuclear program and for the establishment of diplomatic relations. All this failed. So it's very hard to argue who's right and who's wrong. But we must have a kind of approach that can be accepted by both sides, just by giving pressure to the DPRK. What has produced. So
you think the toughest task at hand right now is building basic trust from zero?
I think so. Yeah, and for that to happen, we got to have the two parties in this regard, DPRK and the United States, for the stronger side to probably take the first step. Yeah, that probably will just start the process.
What do you think is the right first step, Dr. Keiko?
Well, I think I'd certainly concur with Senior Colonel's view that the confidence-building measures that were just outlined are very important. And those confidence-building measures can then lead toward more diplomatic discussion and open the door to a more intensive diplomatic dialogue. So, you know, I'm for, definitely for confidence-building measures, as long as both sides are serious about the overall direction.
And what do you make of the role of U.S., Japan, South Korea military alliance in this developing situation on the Korean Peninsula? Do you think it's actually making things worse?
Well, my perspective is slightly different. My perspective is that the major powers, the United States, Russia, China, Japan, need to manage together this flashpoint, this conflict zone, this shatter belt. So this is more similar to maybe what President Xi has suggested about a new type of major power relations. The major powers work together to try to stabilize a region. And we can remember World War I. The major powers did not work together in the Balkans, and it went up. So I think it's essential for the major powers and the UN, of course, obviously, to work together on it. The U.S., Japan, U.S., South Korea, these are kind of older, kind of Cold War alliances that could even be considered somewhat obsolete.
Do you think they're still working in Cold War mentality?
Well,
because we see that Japan is trying to use this as a precursor to deploy that system in its own territory.
I can assure you there's a lot of Cold War thinking still left over in Washington, D.C., and it didn't go away under Obama. And the pivot is a reaction, or the so-called pivot to it follows on some of this Cold War thinking. So what I think, and some of my friends and colleagues think, is we need some new thinking and some new concepts and fresh, dated concepts for Pacific security as a whole and the security of this region.
And this leads to Vice Chairman Fan Changlong's words to General Dunford. He said that the U.S. recent actions, some wrongful actions like meddling in Taiwan and deploying THAAD to South Korea, and also actions in the South China Sea, also activities of spying on China, are actually having a negative effects on Sino-U.S. relations. Do you think the U.S. actually know that it will have a negative effect?
Well,
if they know, why do they do it?
There certainly are critics of that kind of what we could say forward policy, and critics of the pivot policy, which this is all part of. The Trump administration has not really developed a coherent national strategy yet. It has not really developed.
But what's the chain of command here? So you think the military is doing just what they planned?
Basically, I think because of somewhat of disarray in the Trump administration, we're kind of on a cruise control from the Obama administration's pivot. So I think we're kind of continuing this pivot, which included all the measures that you mentioned. Certainly, it's not a problem for the United States if the president wants to reduce all these overflights and to move the patrols out and reduce the frequency of the patrols and all this sorts of things, freedom of navigation operations and all this stuff. If the president wants to tell the military, you know, we're not going to do that, we're going to let Tillerson and State have a bigger role, and we're going to move on the diplomatic front more, that certainly is possible. But basically what's happening is the Trump administration, being in somewhat of a disarray, is just continuing, we're just sort of continuing the old pivot from Obama, and we don't really have a fresh, full-blown Trump, either national strategy or a full-blown, fresh Trump Pacific strategy.
So do you think, Senior Colonel, do you think Donald Trump, President Trump, is willing to change the so-called pivot to Asia policy?
Well, that's a good question, because that's actually a question for everybody before Shangri-La dialogue this year, which I attended. But apparently in General Martin's speech, people haven't found much things new, because I don't think he, as Cliff was correctly pointed out, I don't think he has a clear vision for a new strategy towards Asia Pacific, because when General Martin was talking about the reshifting toward Asia, he was actually following what President Obama has already announced, well, which actually was announced by the former Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, at Shangri-La dialogue. So, but anyway, the new announcement is still interesting in that at least we know, okay, he's pretty much following the same policy of his predecessor.
But these actions do continue. Do you think they're actually damaging?
Well, you are talking about his activities against China. Well, that's a different story, yeah. Because well, let's take the example of U.S. freedom navigation in the South China Sea, for example. Well, the U.S. destroyer McCain's intruding into the 12 nautical miles near China-controlled reefs and shore was actually the third time since President Trump took office. We took it seriously because we, first of all, talk a bit about freedom navigation, which I talked extensively at Shangri-La dialogue. This is actually a non-issue, because both China and the United States agree to this concept of freedom of navigation, but we just interpret it in a different manners, because we do not consider the U.S. military surveillance in China's exclusive economic zone is a kind of lawful freedom of navigation, and China is not standing alone. When people talk about freedom of navigation, these were countries in the West would always point the finger at China. But actually China is not standing alone, because there are about 25 to 29 countries who actually are also against this kind of military activity in the exclusive economic zone. For example, in Asia, in ASEAN countries, I can clearly point out Thailand, Myanmar, and Malaysia as three countries who are against the foreign military activities in the exclusive economic zone. And I can give you an example. Last year in May, when the the exercise of 10 ASEAN countries plus 8 regional powers were conducted in the exclusive economic zone of Malaysia. Malaysia actually protested over it because it violated the national law, which is against the foreign military activities in the exclusive economic zone. Malaysia actually withdrew. So why this issue is so serious with China? Because the U.S. would not conduct as many surveillance and reconnaissance against these countries as it would do to China. So these countries most of the times are silent, but it doesn't mean they agree to this.
So how do you understand U.S. Logic here, Dr. Kia, for kickoff? The U.S. has officially saying that it will not taking sides in the South China Sea dispute, but by doing all those actions we've mentioned, it is actually taking sides to many.
Well, again, what we're doing under Trump is just a continuation of under Obama. And for the United States to signal some different approach, we could certainly wind down or less frequency with the close-in patrols, or move those patrols out, reduce the frequency of the overflights, look at the quality and quantity of weapon sales to Taiwan and maybe kind of reduce that. So there's a lot of signals the United States could send that it has a different policy than Obama. But your question, I think, can be answered simply by saying Trump is basically following the Obama pivot policy, which is kind of an elite consensus policy that was really developed in about 2008. So this pivot policy, and also the geopolitics of India and Australia and Japan kind of encircling China, is part of that pivot policy, geopolitics. And the Trump administration hasn't given us yet a fresh approach, a new geopolitics.
So how long will that learning curve last?
Well, that's a super good question. Basically, there's some issues because Mr. McMaster, for example, has this kind of old, more or less Cold War, idea that China and Russia are revisionist powers, and they want to change the international system and eliminate the U.S.-led global system. So there still is persistence of this sort of Cold War bloc mentality in strategic thinking in the United States. So we have to update, and Trump needs to update and refresh the strategic thinking with some new ideas. And we're not going to get them out of McMaster. Whether he stays there for a while longer or not is subject to as a question. But the issue for Trump is to define his presidency with a fresh approach to the Pacific, and he can certainly engage with President Xi on the concept of a new type of major power relations, and that would indicate, if that's agreed to by the two presidents, that we can do some signaling of kind of winding down some of this provocative.
Let's talk more about that, because, gentlemen, we mentioned a lot of difficult situations, but we can see that willingness to improve military trust and strategic trust is there between the two major countries. And talking about achievements made during General Dunford's visit to China this time, this dialogue mechanism between the two countries' joint chiefs of staff was established. How important is this mechanism?
Well, this is extremely important. Let me give you a background of what kind of mechanism we have between our two armed forces. The good thing is, between the Chinese, we have a lot of mechanism, starting from the so-called hotline, which is actually a direct communicational link, which was turned into a video telephonic link in 2015. And then we have separate dialogues between different services. For example, between the two navies, we have what we call MMCA, which was established as early as 1998 to address the maritime issues, and recently had established the talks between two armies. But this one is above the naval dialogue and the army dialogue, because it is at a joint staff level. Therefore, it addresses strategic issues rather than tactical issues. So essentially, it has two major purposes. First of all, it facilitates strategic communication. Because of the extreme importance of this bilateral relationship, we need to have strategic conversation, and then at this mechanism we can also use it to increase our trust, and more importantly to avoid a crisis or incident between China and the U.S. military. Just in in the South China Sea alone, or in China's exclusive economic zone, we have quite a few incidents or near incidents. So, for example, in 2015, the two countries have established a mutual notification mechanism of major military activities. Therefore, at the general staff level, we can actually implement this kind of agreement between the two. For example, what are the major military activities? For China and for US, they're different. For China, for example, China wants to know what the US would be doing in our periphery. What's your next step? Because we have the serious concerns of American military activities in our periphery. But for US, their concern is different. They are more concerned with your missile program, with your space program, with all these kind of things which are different from Chinese concern. So that's why we need this kind of mechanism even at the strategic level.
So it's for both trust building and crisis management.
Yes.
What's your take on this, Dr.?
Well, I fully concur with Senior Colonel. It's imperative to develop and strengthen mil-mil cooperation. And as was pointed out, this is the top level here, Chief of Staff to Chief of Staff. This is the top level. And again, I'll come back to the symbolism of our Chief of Staff and President Xi talking this afternoon. That kind of image, I think, is so important and will be important back home. One thing that's important for everyone to remember from an American point of view, I mean, we've been out this way for over 200 years. U.S.-China relations were opened in the 1780s. So our commercial ships and Navy have been in this area for over 2 centuries. So hopefully, you know, it'll continue for a few more centuries, but we have to be good neighbors, be polite, et cetera, et cetera. So there will be a continuing presence of U.S. commercial and military vessels, et cetera, in the area. But the key issue is how we manage the relationship and develop proper, appropriate communication, and the United States avoids provocative actions. And we just sort of normalize our military relations.
Right, so is it very common for the United States to establish such a high-level dialogue mechanism with a non-NATO, non-military alliance?
It's very significant. This is very significant. And certainly we our military interacts with basically most all militaries in the world in some way at some level. But this one is really, really a key development, and I'm not going to say a breakthrough, but really it is very significant. So I'm being here in Beijing this week, I'm very excited that this development has happened.
All right, so Senior Colonel, you said this is a very important visit from the top-ranking U.S. military officer. So what will happen in the near future, very quickly?
Well, we hope, as my senior military officer have already extended the invitation to General Mattis. So hopefully General Mattis, as Secretary of Defense, will also visit China. And in the coming months, there would be many things unfolding, because although we have signed a document, but then we're going to have the first round of a talk in Washington in November. And we're also going to do joint exercises. We have talked about a lot of potential areas, for example, in peacekeeping, in counter-piracy, or even probably in counter-terrorism.
Exactly.
So all these areas are areas of great potential for us to work on.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. And that's it for this edition of Dialogue on CGTN. I'm Pan Dong in Beijing. Bye-bye.